Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thanks so much, Martin Schulze. I saw him somewhere. Ladies and gentlemen,
Man kann ja heute an so einem Tag keine Rede beginnen, ohne nochmal
on such a day, we cannot really begin a speech by saying what kind of turning point the war of Russia against Ukraine constitutes, the violation of international law, this aggression that doesn't respect any boundaries, that questions the integrity, the right to existence of a whole state. I think this is a turn of an era, as Olaf Scholz rightfully says. But what does that mean, the turn of an era, the Zeitenwende? It means that all these things we've been taking for granted up to now will be re-evaluated. And Lars Klingbeil has described this very adequately this morning. With a lot of pain, we have to learn that good economic indicators are not sufficient to guarantee peace and prosperity. And we also learn that sanctions against Russia are not free of costs. Rise in prices, bottlenecks in supplies, higher energy costs, inflation, and so on. They pose a big challenge to us as an industrial nation. So even here, a lot of people are facing existential needs. As a social democrat, I have to be clear about it. Those people who live on a smaller wage, they really feel the impact of this crisis. Those that are better off and more wealthy, they have to maybe swallow when they see their energy bill, but it's still possible. But for those people who are already struggling to make ends meet, they cannot do this anymore. It's so difficult for them, and this is why the relief packages that the European Union has launched and Germany has launched is so important. And it's so important to look at what is the impact going to be on our jobs here in Germany, on employment. A lot of people here in Germany fear that their industry does not have any perspective for the future, that they cannot continue their work, that supply bottlenecks, energy prices will have a tremendous effect. And these are things that we need to take care as the federal government, and this is very necessary. We observe this situation here in Germany. This is how we have to deal with this situation. And against this backdrop, we have to imagine what it's like for the global south, for the emerging nations, developing nations. What is their perspective on the war in Ukraine? What is their reaction? And it's very important to understand in the past years, a lot of things have changed already. I can just give you some key phrases so that you know what we're talking about. After the end of the Cold War, that also divided those countries into friend and foe, a process of diversification started with the advent of China to be a superpower and the re-strengthening of Russia. For a lot of developing countries, this presented an opportunity with regards to the donor side, those countries who give development aid, to diversify the donor side. You know, the old colonial Europe and the US, suddenly there was the perspective of Russia and China. And this is mirrored in a lot of infrastructural projects on the African continent. But it also is mirrored in who provides these countries with military equipment. And this made the countries of the Global South much more confident. But only for some years we have understood here in the European Union that benevolent words, a lot of expectations, this is not enough. Partnership means more than that. And moral claims and demands that we very much like to raise will be verified and assessed. Is it really coherent? We demand coherence from the developing countries, but they will also assess whether our demands are coherent. This very quick and tough reaction towards the Russian aggression, this is what a lot of African countries would have liked to see when it comes to wars and genocide on their continent. A lot of countries in the Global South, in Iraq and Libya and Yugoslavia, they also see this a violation of the international law, and they accuse us of double standards. And with respect to these diversified donors that they have, they do not want to take up a clear position. They do not want to be part of our conflict. And this may also have primarily economic reasons. Already during the COVID pandemic, a lot of African states remember very well how the global north will first and foremost take care of itself. And, for example, didn't really pay attention or acknowledge how South Africa recognized Omicron. We didn't say, oh, this is great that you've discovered this, we're going to support you. No, instead, we closed our borders. And this is a very strong memory in the global south. I really perceived that to be a tricky matter. And then with COVID, the pandemic, I cannot explain all the consequences in depth, but we are talking about shadow crises that were triggered by the pandemic. And in all core areas of the sustainability goals, we have been pushed back by decades. The global south really thinks that only when the global north is trying to understand that it will only be safe when the global south is also safer, and this is only when the global north started acting and actually taking measures. But the crisis that we see in the developing and emerging countries and nations, these crises are so severe, they're already pushed to the limit of their financial possibilities. And in addition to this already very difficult situation, comes the war here in Europe. The war and its consequences. These will also be borne by the developing countries: high energy costs, high prices for food. And this impact is tough because we already feel the impact of climate change in the global south. Because of debt, because of bad harvest, crop failures, and so on, and because of already a lot of problems being present in the global south. Of course, I could develop and elaborate more on each and every one of these points, and I'm sure we're going to do that during the discussion. I think some of these accusations are already also a bit distorted or one-sided, for sure. But we have to take this perception seriously. We have to perceive their perception and be clear about the fact that there are different perspectives. There is also a war of narratives. There is a very clear Russian narrative that the West is to blame. It's our fault because of the sanctions. It's us who have triggered the food crisis and not because Putin bombarded the aid supply. So the question is always, what does the North do to limit this war and mitigate the effects on the global south? And this is where the Zeitenwende, the turn of an era, starts. It shows that development policy is also prescient geopolitical policy. It is our interest to look at potential famines, to look at debt relief, to make a contribution to create resilient health system, resilient food systems. Fair trade needs to become a standard. Also, fair trade with the North, to close the digital gap, to take climate protection seriously, because it's important for us and the global South. We have to assume our responsibility. We have to take up our responsibility and make sure that supply chains are also coherent with our standards, that minimum wages are being paid. You know, we could fill whole panels and events with all these topics, and this is what the Friedrich Ebert Foundation is also doing. Let us not ignore all these issues. If we only look at ourselves, then we will lose very important partners that we need in a new geopolitical order, especially if the conflict with China will be exacerbated in future, and a lot of indicators hint at that. Next to financial support and economic support, we also have to figure out how we can find diplomatic solutions to the war. How can we prepare for that? And we have to make sure not to think in a binary way. Yes, for sure, we hope for Ukraine to push back the aggressor, but what if that doesn't succeed immediately? Wolfgang Zellner just wrote it in an international journal, International Politics. What happens if a frozen situation will arrive? A flexible geometry of reactions might be necessary in this frozen conflict. We need to work together in order to advance with these matters that threaten the whole of humankind, for example, climate change, and the impact will be most severe in the global south. How do we deal with this? How do we live this new architecture of the global order? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. We need to look at the relationship between development and security policy. Olaf Scholz said on the 27th of February in his speech that the response to the Zeitenwende cannot just be military. Of course, he's a social democrat. Weapons alone will not bring peace, and they may never be the first and only response. I think it is rather bizarre what is being written in many media, where it's only about weapons delivery, types of tanks. But there is no discussion about hunger, poverty, inequality as structural root causes of conflict. These kind of discussions cannot be found in the media anymore.
Aber ich sage hier ganz deutlich, ich werde auch
But let me say it very clearly, I'm not going to tire saying it. Yes, military capacities are needed in order to be prepared, but the military logic may not dictate our approach. It may not be our point of reference. And this is important to say as a social democrat because I'm proud of our tradition of peace politics. We need a strong development policy in order to face the threats of the future. Education, health, civil society, democratic development. These are the aspects that are needed in a world of tomorrow. More than ever, we need to emphasize solidarity. It can never be one-way direction. If we want to partner up with other countries in future conflicts, then the other way around, we need to take their problems seriously, their challenges, and be in solidarity. And let me get to the end, so we'll have some time left for discussion. The Zeitenwende, the turn of an era. What does it need? A strong development policy so that the international community will be able to react quickly in an appropriate way to conflict and crisis. We need it for resilient societies so that these societies can cope with the challenges of today's, and we need it so that geopolitical shifts do not create new dependencies. A strong development policy is a crucial contribution for international peace consolidation. Thank you so much.